So what do we do when we first start off? Basically, we start to work with the simplest forms that we can, which are our basic primitive shapes. Now, I just want you to get comfortable drawing things like cubes, cylinders, spheres, and cones, because these are the things that we're going to be using to build all of our forms and construct things like figures and creatures and robots and all of that fun stuff down the line. Now, it's okay if your lines don't look the best or if you're still learning to control your hand when it comes to certain marks or striking certain marks. It's just a bit of showcasing that you need to work on certain areas or elements, or that you can just clean them up later in the cleanup phase. So you can practice drawing lots of different types of circles, see which way feels good to your hand, if you're going counterclockwise or clockwise, and then connecting them up together, because if you're missing it, that's just, again, an indicator that you just need to do more reps. The same way that if you want bigger biceps, you need to move up in weight and keep doing bicep curls. So you can just keep trying that and trying not to go quite as far under or quite as far over. And for me, I'm left-handed, so counterclockwise feels the best. And I just keep on playing with these circles until I'm getting shapes that I like. It's really, really fun and really relaxing. Next, you can try to mess with a bunch of lines. So find one angle you like for your hand and just make some lines. These lines should be, approximately the same length and approximately the same angle. Now, you can practice lines of varying angles close together or spread them further apart. This is another thing to practice for just basic drawing, mechanical and technical movement. I really like to try a lot of different angles and see which ones feel best, see which ones maybe don't feel so good, and try and harness techniques to get those ones that don't feel good a little bit better, or think of situations that I might use them in, such as if I need to make something look a little more random or squiggly, then I might work that angle of my hand. So after we've started to kind of spend our day one doing things like this, what we're going to be doing in day two is spending time shading the surfaces with those lines. So you can just start to put these lines together on the surface of some of your shapes and work your way toward being able to cover one of the surface planes. And one of the surface planes is just any plane that makes a transition. So these transitions are going to be based on shading. Shading is what occurs when light is falling upon one part of the surface and not so much another. So for example, if we have our light source here, we'll do a nice little cute sun doodle and just pretend that this is the sun, and the sun is hitting this one the most, this one the second most, and this one the least. Therefore, this would be the brightest, this would be the second brightest, and this would be the third brightest, or even in shadow. In addition, we would have to think, okay, well, we probably have to block in a shadow because this whole shape is blocking this area from getting illuminated. So we would use some of our shading here to kind of show that. And again, you don't have to worry about everything being perfect and clean and crisp. This is what learning to draw looks like. It looks like trying to draw on the forms. It looks like missing your circles. It looks like having wavery or uncertain lines when you try and make a straight line. But then you figure out, well, maybe there's a technique for this type of line. Maybe if I have lines that go like this, it makes a nice edge for like a riverbed. Or maybe if some of my lines just don't come out the way I want them, then I just find ways to use that down the line as I'm doing free-form flowing shapes. So we're not going to talk about flowing shapes quite yet, just because those are a little more abstract and harder to control. We want to get used to constructing things first and foremost, and shading things that we're constructing, because all these basic shapes are the building blocks, as I stated earlier, for what we're going to be making down the line. So you might look back and evaluate your shading and say, well, this isn't the type of shading I necessarily want. Maybe you want more cross-hatching. Maybe you would rather just increase the size of your brush or use the side of your pencil or your medium, and you'd rather just fill it in like that, because that's valid as well. So there's lots of different ways to shade, lots of different ways to learn these different techniques, but I want you to start thinking about things in their component parts. So in other words, the component parts are each part that makes up something. And whenever you're thinking about the parts that make up something, like say the wheels of the car, the axles of the car, the windows of the car, you start to get a picture of how a car is made by understanding the parts. That is how you're going to basically get an idea of how a drawing is made, by understanding all the pieces. So for example, I can sketch in some shapes and kind of combine them together and, roughly start to assemble a mannequin, which is one of the best ways to start to learn to draw the figure. So all these are still pretty much built on basic shapes. I'm not going too crazy or too complex, but we could always get to that level later as we learn and progress through our drawings. Drawing can be a very organic learning process, especially when you're practicing with principles and starting off in ways that are going to be beneficial as you practice them more and more with repetition. Oftentimes we just try to dive right in way past our skill, and we end up frustrated and not understand why things didn't work, when in reality we just didn't know the principles behind it. We didn't have ways to solve all the problems that we ran into. Therefore, it's very, very wise to just start practicing the principles right off the bat, because that way when you run into some of these problems, you'll understand how to fix them, and understand that when you're studying, when you're learning, when you're just relaxing and drawing your shapes, you're still adding mileage, you're still building skill, and it becomes a very natural way of getting better versus a very forced way. Oftentimes, you have to just manage your expectations and say to yourself, I am not going to be the greatest artist on the planet, or I'm going to compete with the masters. Just say, I want to draw better today than I drew yesterday. And even if you don't necessarily meet that goal, it doesn't mean that you're entirely off track or you're broken or something is wrong with you. It just means that maybe you're having a bad drawing day. Maybe you're using a technique that is not for you. Maybe you are just putting too much pressure on yourself. Maybe you're not in the right mindset to draw. There's a million and one things that could be the case if you're not having a good time drawing, but all in all, it should just not come back and reflect on you as like some sort of deeply flawed or problematic person, or drawing is just not for you, or you're not talented enough, because that is just sort of a way to create derision and problems and, not have good mental health, not have a good time learning and just enjoying the process. Doodling is a great way to relax, and it should be just that. And when you're doodling based on principles and things that you're practicing, you can always start to elaborate more down the line. So again, just shading on the forms, just looking into different ways that you can create a little more dimension, and maybe you try to shade some of these circles differently. So we've used a lot of these like sort of semi-connected lines. Maybe we want to be a little more precise with the way that these lines line up. Maybe we want to go slower and just try to line them up even more perfectly. And that is a very calming process. That's a very fun process. And if we try to go a little too fast, maybe we had a little too much coffee that day. And that's okay too. It's just gonna reflect the state of your body, the state of your mind, the state of what sort of approach you have when it comes to your drawing. So slowing down is very, very helpful for a lot of things. You can tell when something was made with haste versus when it's a little more designed. One thing you can also do is just practice different types of scribbles and mark making. So it's all about generating the freedom in the beginning to just let yourself make mistakes, to let yourself explore and experiment and find ways to make things that start to look good for you and look good to you. And you say, well, how do I develop this? Where would I use this? Is this a type of shading? Is this a type of texture? And is this a type of technique I want to pursue and continue and refine? Because that's how you're going to build your style over time. Another thing is just to constantly draw through things. See the forms that are appearing whenever you're drawing something. So for example, if I draw on the surface of this cylinder and I try and line up my ellipses, which are just circles in perspective, with the cylinder, that's a great exercise. It's not easy to do, but the more that you do it, the easier it gets. And it's okay if things are not looking perfect. Again, I want to stress that. You don't have to be perfect. Nothing has to be perfect. You just do the absolute best that you can, and if it doesn't come out the way you thought it would come out, then you try again. And the second try should be based on what you learned during the first. And maybe it's even worse than your first try. And then you say, well, I learned what not to do even more. So it's a lot of trial and error, and I don't think that a lot of beginner artists understand that. You always look at the end result or these great sketches, but you're not seeing the hundreds, if not thousands, of pieces that an artist who is more advanced has made in order to get to the level that they're at. And oftentimes the master or even the adept has failed more times than the beginner has even tried. So that's something to keep in mind as well. It's one of the secrets that will allow you to ascend in artistic power and proficiency much quicker than if you were to put all this pressure on yourself and have unrealistic expectations and dive into notions of whether or not you're talented, because at the end of the day, that's sort of a waste. The only things you want to be focusing on are, how can I make something a little bit better, even just 1% better? You know, clean up the edges or have a little bit better shading, or find a technique that you like and keep practicing it over and over. For example, I've showed you a lot of different ways of making marks and shading in just this little example demo, and any of them could be turned into fully fledged techniques for creating things you want to create. After you're doing a lot of this and you get used to drawing on the surface of stuff, you know, making little designs or practicing breaking it up in interesting ways, then you can begin to, like I said, put stuff together. If this is all like level 1 stuff, then this would be where we start to get into like level 2 stuff, and level 2 stuff being like shading and putting together like figures in very basic, like mannequinized ways. So it's just about having a clear progression between, you know, these simpler exercises and adding just a little more complexity. You wouldn't lay down on the bench press and say, I'm gonna rep 400 pounds. You would say, I'm gonna see what I can do maybe 10 times, and that'll give me a better idea of what I can rep 8 times or 6 times or even your 1 rep max. And fortunately, you don't need somebody to spot you when you're drawing, because there's literally no danger that you're going to have a plate of weights fall on your chest or your body. So you can get really experimental and have a lot of fun, and really just take it a lot easier and have a lot less stress behind that process. So I just want to wish you the best on your drawing journey. I encourage you to practice a lot of little squares and cubes and cylinders and just have fun with it. Just explore your lines. Explore the way that they feel as they come out of your hand and move onto the page. Explore what you like and what you don't like in terms of the look of the lines, in terms of their overlap, in terms of creating little bits of shading. And again, ask yourself where you can use stuff like this, or if it's useful at all, and if you would rather be creating various, say, pieces that will have more out of use for you. So if something doesn't look good, just don't be afraid to get rid of it and then try to make it look better on the second attempt. And then you can say, okay, well, I like the second one a little bit better. What did I do differently? And it's like, oh, the lines were a little more certain, and now I have a clear idea of what I was trying to draw, and it's a feather. And you say, well, it was sort of a feather before, but I didn't have a clear idea because it was just the first sketch, the initial sketch. And it's like, well, this isn't the greatest feather. How would I make this better? And then you would have to look up reference for a feather, and you would start to draw it. For example, if you've ever seen a feather, they're incredibly fine. And you would have to replicate that by doing a lot of small shading lines, or you could just simplify it and have this general shape of like a quill and say, well, that's basically the shape of a feather. So if I drew a lot of those together, I would have a wing, but I would need to understand the big shape of the wing first. So you start to break down these problems and these ideas into digestible bits and portions, because it eventually comes down to your approach and how you handle what you're seeing in your mind's eye versus what is coming out of your hand, and how those things are going to line up, and when to erase and redraw them, when to go through the process of refining them. And this is all stuff that I've covered on this YouTube channel and in my drawing courses. So if you have any interest in evolving with more structure, with more fundamental understanding of things like light and color and shadow and shape, then it's just going to behoove you to check some of that stuff out and keep playing around, keep practicing. Bring a sketchbook with you everywhere. Put it in your bag, in your car, so that when you're waiting and your car is turned off and you're not driving, or when you're on the bus or what have you, then you can just begin to continue your practice. And over time it'll become something that's second nature to you. But that's when you really have to get clear on what you're doing with your abilities. Then you begin to ask yourself questions like, well, what do I really want to express? You know, am I feeling more drawn to illustration? Do I want to do a lot more design and concepting? And when you have a fundamental understanding of what makes those things work, you know, the way that shapes fall across one another, or the way that light makes something appear, then you begin to have a stronger sense of how to execute ideas that you have. So it becomes more a game of, well, what do I want to do rather than how do I do it? It's just something that will add a lot of richness to your own self-expression and your own human experience. You don't draw because you want to be rich. You don't draw because you want to be the greatest artist of all time. I mean, there's like probably one or two individuals where that really applies, but for the most part, it's just a meaningful kind of activity that you use to get more into self-expression, more into giving form to ideas you've always had, like characters or creatures or backgrounds and landscapes, because you just have to find a way to get certain ideas out and share those ideas with people. Maybe you're a very social person and you want to join a group with artists, and in that case you can find the Growth Path group for artists that I've created, where we work on projects or we work on measurable metrics for improving our art and getting clear on where we're going with it. So all of these things I have for you in the description box, and I hope you've had a good time today, just sort of relaxing, drawing, not getting too overly crazy about it. I would say at this point you're probably more curious than you are serious if you're watching videos like this. So just lean into that curiosity until it starts to become sincerity, until it starts to become a stronger drive for you to move forward with. And it's okay to be wherever you're at on the journey. You can just relax in that and just have fun and just practice little shapes. Get used to erasing, get used to cleaning stuff up, and get used to testing ideas. You know, if you want to see what it looks like when you make a certain type of line, or if you want to try drawing something and just detaching from the outcome. So it's okay to be curious, but the deeper you go, you're probably going to feel a lot more serious about it, and that's okay too. So again, I'm Taylor Payton. I help artists get further faster and face their fears so that they can ascend artistically. And I will see you in the next video. Take care and happy drawing.